Naruto is a series that has been analyzed and examined to death by fans all over the world, myself included, and rightfully so because it's an amazing series with new things to discover every time you read or watch it. However, among all the topics people speak about when it comes to Naruto, whether it be the themes, characters, fights, plot, or whatever, there is an aspect woven into the story that I never see people talk about. It's possible that a lot of you might not have even noticed this outside of a subconscious acknowledgement, and I don't blame you because this is a battle shonen. The focus is on the cool fights, the character stories, the incredible emotional moments, and today's topic is so subtle within the story that it doesn't really register in your mind as what it truly is. And that, of course, is horror. Now, anybody who knows me knows that one of my favorite genres of media is horror, and it's something that I want to dive into a lot more on the channel going forward. But instead of looking at a work of fiction that is meant to be horror, I thought it might be interesting to look at the way Naruto uses horror in its own story despite not being a horror manga at all. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, horror in Naruto? What the f is this guy on about? Well, let's get right down to the point of this discussion, and that is that I believe that Kishimoto uses horror in Naruto to portray evil. Now, that might sound like an obvious statement because, yeah, of course he would want to make the villains scary, but that's not exactly what I'm getting at. There's actually a specific type of horror that Kishimoto uses to make his villains stand out, and that he uses as almost a way to symbolize evil within his universe. And that is what most of the horror community refers to as body horror. For those of you who aren't familiar, body horror or biological horror is a subgenre of horror that intentionally showcases grotesque or psychologically disturbing violations of the human body. Essentially, anything relating to the human body that one would deem unnatural. This includes deformities, modifications, gore, etc. And Kishimoto actually utilizes it a lot throughout the series. It's almost as though the amount of body horror present in a character's design or abilities directly reflects or symbolizes the amount of evil within them, or in some cases, the amount of evil that they've been influenced by. It's important to note that none of the characters in Naruto one might consider good have any signs of body horror whatsoever. But let's take a look at the villains in the series. I think we can skip over Zabuza and Haku because they were more or less good people at their core. Zabuza less so than Haku, but his goal was still to free the Mist Village from the tyranny of its current Mizukage, and so his motivations were not entirely evil when boiled down to their core elements. He simply had a dark past due to the village he grew up in, and was forced to take on some less than honorable work in order to raise money for another coup in the mist. But I think Zabuza and Haku were good people when it really came down to it. To reflect this, Haku is absent of any body horror, and Zabuza's is minimal at best. But let's take a look at likely the most horrific character in the entire series, Orochimaru. If I asked you to think of a Naruto character that the term unnatural best applies to, I have no doubts that Orochimaru comes to the forefront of most people's minds. Orochimaru is the embodiment of evil in Naruto, at least in part 1. He is selfish, greedy, and ruthless. His goals are to gain immortality, learn every jutsu in existence, and get his revenge on the Leaf Village. To achieve these goals, Orochimaru will stop at nothing. I'm talking kidnapping, murder, human experiments, using people for his own gain. He plays with people's lives as if they are nothing. Now, coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, Orochimaru is equally as vile physically as he is morally. He has the characteristics of a snake, a long tongue that can extend to great lengths, yellow slitted eyes, pale skin and long black hair, almost reminiscent of an onryo from Japanese folklore. He often steals the faces of his victims and peels that skin off when he wants to reveal his true face underneath. He can shed his entire body to heal damage, swallow things that a human has no business swallowing like swords and scrolls, and he is able to stretch and contort his body in very inhuman-like ways. I could go on, but I think you all know the kinds of disgusting things that Orochimaru is capable of. Now, if you didn't know that I was describing a Naruto character, this could easily pass as some creature from a horror story. I think Hiruzen puts it best after witnessing Orochimaru appear as the girl whose body he stole. In the manga, he says, "You terrible inhuman fellow," but I quite like the anime rendition better where he calls him a demon. And this is farther shown later in the series when Orochimaru is attacked by Sasuke and he takes on his true form as a giant white snake, made up of hundreds of smaller snakes with a human-like head and a detached jaw. Easily one of the creepiest looking things in the series. But this showcases that Orochimaru, through his endless experiments and lust for power, has turned himself into this monster, so far from the human that he was born as. It's a perfect physical manifestation of Orochimaru's evil. It seems as though the message hidden within the designs of Kishimoto's villains is that those who seek power for the wrong reasons often mutilate themselves in the process. They sacrifice part of their humanity to achieve their goals. It's a metaphor, but at the same time, it's showcased very literally using body horror in the Naruto universe. We can look at everyone who is associated with Orochimaru in the series too and draw the same conclusion. Body horror is almost a staple of Orochimaru and his goons, almost as if his evil is so great that it spreads to everyone he touches. Let's look at the Sound 4, or 5. Kidomaru has 6 arms and vomits up spiderwebs. Sakon and Ukon could merge into each other's body. Ukon's head usually protruded from Sakon's back when they were in combat. Jirobo and Tayuya didn't necessarily have body horror in base, but the same can't really be said for Tayuya's summons. Either way though, they all had Orochimaru's curse mark, which would have them all undergo a very twisted demon-like transformation, changing their skin color, growing horns, and other abnormalities. Then there is Kimimaro, who, along with also having a curse mark, would quite literally pull the bones from his skin to use as weapons. Out of every member of the Sound 5, Kimimaro was the one who was most strongly committed to Orochimaru and his goals. And he just so happens to be the one with the most grotesque abilities out of all of the members. Much like Orochimaru, Kabuto is another character who I would consider truly evil throughout the majority of the series. In some ways more so than Orochimaru. Kabuto's goal by the end of the series was simply to become the best version of himself imaginable. This meant making a name for himself in the 4th Great Shinobi War, as well as taking revenge on the shinobi system that ruined his life. Kabuto was a chaotic evil in the 4th War. He defiled corpses and caused the deaths of thousands of shinobis through his reanimation jutsu. His goals were entirely selfish and had no greater purpose beyond his own aspirations, much like Orochimaru. And also much like Orochimaru, the amount of body horror present in his design at that point matched his intentions. Even Sasuke Uchiha himself had body horror incorporated into his design after falling into Orochimaru's clutches. Sasuke before Orochimaru had no signs of body horror, but when Sasuke fought Naruto in the Final Valley, it was as if he was fully committing to this dark path of revenge, and reflecting that, his curse mark transformation turns him into a monster. Giant hands with webbed fingers and long nails emerge from his back, the whites of his eyes turn black. Much like the rest of Orochimaru's subjects, Sasuke in that moment becomes like a demon. But it isn't just Orochimaru and his followers that have body horror present in their designs. Gaara has a transformation opposite of Sasuke's in which he goes from evil to good. What sort of images do we see from Gaara before Naruto changes him? Cracked, falling apart skin from his sand armor, a partial-tailed beast transformation that makes him look deformed, yet later in the series when Gaara has reformed, we don't get imagery like this surrounding his character anymore. Let's take a look at the Akatsuki. Deidara's only goal is to show the world his art in the form of devastating explosions. He's more or less a terrorist. Reflecting that evil, he has mouths on his hands and a big one on his chest. He also has both his arms sewn back on after losing them, making him even more grotesque. Sasori is basically the Orochimaru of the Sand Village, looking to add more puppets into his twisted collection. Reflecting his evil, he turned his whole body into a puppet, and he uses the bodies of others as puppets. This is body horror. Hidan and Kakuzu are another pair of characters that I would consider purely evil. Hidan wants only to kill for his god Jashin, and Kakuzu only wants money. Their motivations are purely violent and greedy. And look at them. Hidan is not so bad on first glance until you find out that his ability is literally just stabbing and mutilating himself in order to harm his opponent. He even has his head removed at one point and sewn back on. Kakuzu is almost as much of a freak as Orochimaru is, being able to detach his body parts and keep them connected with these black tendrils in his body. Because of this, his body is covered in stitches. The sclera of his eyes are red and his iris/pupil is green. He then has 4 masks sewn into his back. Kakuzu is an absolute monster. Kisame is a man whose job used to be to kill his own teammates. He is then entirely loyal to the Akatsuki and its goals. I wouldn't say he is as evil as the others, but he's definitely not a good dude. Reflecting this, he has blue skin, sharp teeth, and gills. He's literally a shark human. But here's where things get interesting when it comes to the body horror in Naruto. Sure, the characters with motivations rooted in selfish evil all have some sort of grotesque features, but what about the ones that aren't so black and white? Itachi, unlike his partner and the rest of the Akatsuki, has no body horror, perhaps hinting that he was never a monster like the others. As we come to find out, Itachi's intentions were always for the sake of protecting the Leaf Village and his little brother. He was never an evil person. Konan was a character who only supported the goals of her friends Nagato and Yahiko. I wouldn't really label her as evil either. She later allied herself with Naruto and the Leaf when she realized that they were on the wrong path. You could say in some way that her paper abilities could be body horror, but they come across as more of a beautiful transformation than anything. So much like Itachi, Konan is without body horror and without evil as well. Pain, on the other hand, considers himself a god and definitely commits acts that one could label as evil, even if he doesn't see it that way. However, upon first glance, his body horror is minimal. He's really just a dude with some piercings. This is, of course, until we find out that what we are seeing when looking at the 6 paths of pain are actually dead bodies being controlled remotely by way of the chakra rods implanted into them. Then when we meet the real Nagato, we find him looking completely decrepit attached to some big machine. But why is it that Nagato isn't immediately recognized as having body horror like so many of the other villains? He doesn't exactly appear to be grotesque in any way when he appears as Pain. I think it's because Nagato is not entirely evil. His motives are actually that of peace. It's important that we differentiate between motives and actions when it comes to this body horror subject. There's no denying that Pain's actions can be considered evil, but the goal he is trying to achieve is a bit more of a gray area. Almost good if we only look at what he really wants, which is, like I said, peace. Since his motives are so gray, his body horror is as well. Does that make sense? Same can be said for Madara and Obito. Neither of them immediately appear unnatural at first glance, and they are definitely not characters people would think of when discussing the most grotesque designs in Naruto. However, hidden behind their motives of peace are the actions of evil. Just as hidden behind Obito's mask is his slightly deformed face from being crushed by the rock and repaired with white Zetsu. Just as underneath Madara's armor, you have the face of Hashirama protruding from his chest where he grafted some of the first Hokage's flesh onto himself. It's also interesting that the moment Obito was crushed and saved by Madara can be considered the moment when his path towards darkness began, the moment Madara got a hold of him. This is, coincidentally, the moment that his character design acquired some body horror. I think my favorite example of this, however, is actually Danzo. Danzo's motives are that of protecting the Leaf Village. All he does is to make sure the village remains strong, but in order to achieve this, Danzo does some pretty shady things in the shadows. So the body horror present on Danzo is obviously the multiple eyes embedded into his arm, but he keeps it covered up. So just as his acts of evil are hidden within the shadows, so too is the corresponding body horror hidden in his character design. Now sure, it might be a reach to say that Kishimoto was intentionally matching the body horror to the amount and manner of evil present within each character. Maybe it was purely coincidence, or maybe it was some subconscious design choice that just came to him naturally when designing Naruto's villains. But regardless, I think it's very interesting how the mutilation and modification of one's body in Naruto is at least used to paint the villains as less human and more monster. If anything, it shows desperation in them. a lust for power or to achieve their goals by any means, a physical manifestation of evil, a loss of humanity. Whether or not the amount of body horror present directly relates to the amount of evil within a character is up for debate. But even if that isn't the case, what isn't up for debate is the fact that Kishimoto definitely uses body horror in Naruto to make his villains more inhuman. And I think that alone is interesting enough to talk about. Anyways, not a super complex topic today, just pointing out an aspect of Kishimoto's character design that people might not have noticed. Leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you are new to the channel. Also, consider sharing my video somewhere. On Twitter or wherever, any more eyes that I can get on the channel is good. Appreciate it, guys. Anyways, see you guys next time. Peace out.